Stone Canyon. Well, pardon me. I'm going to adjust my camera. I notice it looks like I'm giving you the side eye when I'm looking at you. Thanks so much for being here. Well, good afternoon. Are you ready to kick this off, Mike? I'm so excited to be able to talk with you today. Ready to go?
I am happy to be here.
Well, for those who don't already know, Mike O'Connell is the president and chief executive officer of the Irvine Ranch Conservancy. And it's a pretty incredible, special place. And if you wouldn't mind, would you please start out by telling us, like, what is the Open Space Preserve and maybe a little bit about what makes it so special?
Sure, absolutely. So first I would say the city of Irvine is a unique city in that it has a very large part of the city dedicated to urban wilderness. Almost a third of the city is open space. And a lot of people think of open space as being parks and greenways and things like that when they think of a city. But the city of Irvine's open space is special because it also includes 6,600 acres of real wilderness. And that includes rare habitats and rare species and all kinds of fantastic opportunities that are really, really close in. It's a special place not only because of that, but because of the actual nature that is there. We are actually living in California. We live in what's called a Mediterranean climate zone. And a Mediterranean climate zone is found in only 5 places on the planet. It's on the west side of continents. So it's on Western North America, Western Australia, Southwestern Africa, the Mediterranean, obviously, and Southwestern South America, Chile. These lands have only 2% of the land area of the planet, but they have over 20% of all known plant species. So in terms of biodiversity value, these lands are as important to global biodiversity as coral reefs, as rainforests. They're really unique, especially if you're an insect. It has very, very, very high insect diversity, believe it or not. So these lands are not only special because of where they are and they're so close into the city, but they truly are important natural habitats as well. In fact, they're so important that in 2006, the National Park Service declared these lands part of a national natural landmark. And in 2008, on Earth Day, the state of California also designated these lands as part of the first California natural landmark. In the case of the National Natural Landmark designation, this is the only place in the country out of 600 natural landmarks that was dedicated for both the geology and the biology. So these are really, really special lands and they're part of Irvine.
Well, that's incredible. I never knew that it was part of the National Natural Landmark.
Yep.
I consider myself pretty familiar with the open space. I know you talked about some of the diversity, and I'll tell you some of the things that are incredible that I've personally seen is the chalk dudleya, right? Which is one of which is an endangered species, and it grows in this area. It's actually really cool it grows in the side of rocks.
It's a succulent.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing plant.
Yeah.
And there's a cypress that we have that actually I ask Mike to visit every time we go into the wildlands because it smells so amazing. And can you tell us just a little quick story about the cypress and why it's so interesting?
Sure. Yeah, there is a plant that lives on the open space. It's not actually in Irvine proper, but it's near Irvine. You can get to it from Irvine. And it's called the Tecate cypress tree. And it's only found in 3 places in the planet. One of them is Tecate, Mexico. Another is the Otay Mountains in southern San Diego, right along the border. And the third place is on the historic Irvine Ranch up in Upper Fremont Canyon. There are only a couple thousand individuals left. And in fact, the heyday of this cypress tree was during the last major ice age, during what the geologists call the Pleistocene era. That's when mastodons roamed the earth and giant ground sloths, and there were condors flying all over. And that was when this plant did its best, and now it's hanging out in only 3 pockets in the world, and we have one of them here.
Well, and I love every time we go to the one cypress that's right off the trail, Mike always says, well, who knows what that cowboy was thinking when he decided to put that cypress here. This is just marking the trail. So, I mean, you think about the rich history of this landscape, and its immediate history is really interesting, but of course it has this extensive, going back to the Ice Age history. So going back to the recent history, Mike, would you tell us a little bit about how the open space is part of a larger protected landscape? Did we lose Mike? Okay, looks like we lost Mike. What's really cool is the immediate history and the long-term history. So when you said, like, Irvine is the name of an early founder of Orange County, and he owned a large ranch, right? And so when it was divided up into different parcels and put to different uses, much of the area retained the name, even though it isn't incorporated in the city proper. So, for example, we have Irvine Park, which is named after James Irvine and the Irvine family, but it is it's outside the boundaries of the city of Irvine. So I'd like to have Mike, when he comes back in, tell us all about the...
Coming right back in now.
Yeah, is he coming back in?
I'm back.
There he
Hey,
is.
Mike, I've been filling in, so
I was
you
kidnapped
take
by
over.
aliens. I was kidnapped by aliens. No, I'm.
Here's what I teed you up for. I kind of inexpertly went through the difference between the Irvine Ranch, James Irvine, the Irvine family, Irvine Park. So I'm going to let you give the formal story.
So a little bit of the history is what we're doing. So for well over 100 years, the lands that were part of the historic Irvine Ranch were owned by the Irvine family, and they were ranched and farmed, and a lot of the orange groves that gave Orange County its name were on the Irvine Ranch. And then in the early 1960s, the Irvine family started doing a master plan for the ranch, and they didn't want to see happen to their family land what was happening to a lot of the Spanish ranchos after World War II. They were all getting broken up and turned into tract home developments. And so they wanted to do a master plan, and it took them about 10 years to finish. And then they started to implement it. The late 1970s, 1979, was when the Irvine company at that time, owned by the Irvine family, was sold to Donald Bren, who has been the chairman ever since. And that was really when the master plan really took off in terms of its implementation, and it's resulted in what we have today. The original master plan for the Irvine Ranch only contained about 10% open space, believe it or not. It was greenways and little river corridors and things like that, and parks. But the idea of large blocks of open space, urban wilderness, really took off after Donald Bren took over the company. And he had an advantage because the Irvine family had taken such good care of the land for so long that he was able to have a lot to work with. And there were a lot of community activists, and there were people that were involved. There were conservation and development plans that were done, and that's a whole other webinar. But ultimately what happened was that more than 50% of the original Irvine Ranch was set aside in open space, and a big chunk of that, like I mentioned, about 6,600 acres, is in the city of Irvine. The majority of it is actually in the county of Orange, and it's now owned by the county. All this open space is publicly owned, but it's actually really important because these lands are part of this larger protected landscape. The city of Irvine lands don't exist in isolation. There's an open space preserve south and an open space preserve north, in North Irvine and South Irvine. The open space preserve in South Irvine is actually connected to Crystal Cove State Park, and it's connected to Laguna Coast Wilderness Park. And I kind of defy you to go out on the land and find out where the line is, right? What we like to say is the wildlife don't know where the boundaries are, and neither do the people who enjoy the lands. And so it's really important that it all be managed cohesively and together. And that's part of what our charge is. In the north, the city of Irvine lands, everything you see up to the ridge line in Irvine is part of the city of Irvine's open space preserve, but everything over that ridge all the way to the 91 freeway is also part of that same protected landscape. And that's what we're all benefiting from now.
Yeah, well, and it looks like I know that we have people in the chat who know a lot about the Irvine Ranch Conservancy, and there are people who don't know anything at all. So I think this is going to be really a wonderful hour where, and hang on, because there's a lot of show and tell too. So, but I think the way you talked about the landscape as being the Irvine Ranch as being part of a larger part of the landscape. I mean, it's so important to have these connections for biodiversity reasons and because of the size of the range of certain animals.
Yep.
And we are really in a very, very unique position to have done this. And so many people talk about the uniqueness of Irvine with 1/3 of our land in open space. Now, even, and that's what makes us the largest city by mass in Orange County. Now, let's talk just before we move to the fun stuff about what's actually out there. Let's set us up with what's so special about the Irvine Ranch partnership and the contract. So for how it's managed. For example, we had a question about whether this was protected from the developers. So maybe you could talk about the level of protection, the level of use, and what's required on the ranch.
Sure. Well, I can tell you that all of the land as part of the open space preserve is permanently protected without doubt. It's got multiple layers of protection. It has deed restrictions, and it has zoning that the city has set up as preservation. It's in the general plan. I actually forgot to mention one of my favorite things about working with Irvine is that Irvine is the only city that I've ever encountered in my entire career that has the word biodiversity in its general plan principles. That's really, really remarkable. And people who live in Irvine should be really proud of that. But the land itself is protected forever from development. A key factor in that was in 1988, the residents of Irvine, the voters of Irvine, voted to actually increase density in some areas of development in exchange for these large protected areas. That was called the Open Space Initiative, and I think the voter day was Earth Day of 1988, at least that's when we celebrate it. And so what it did was it set up this framework for land use in Irvine that has resulted in the permanent protection of all those lands. But to answer your question more directly, Melissa, the challenge is only partly solved by protecting the land, especially in an urban context like this. So there's this tendency to think that once the development threat is gone, that these lands are all going to be fine. And it turns out that that's not the case. It turns out that these lands require really active management in order to remain healthy. I mean, our goal and the city's goal is to make sure that these lands are healthy and the wildlife thrives and they're resilient to things like wildfire and drought, and they function as ecosystems, not just now, but for many, many generations into the future. And that takes a really active management. And so that's what the city has set up with its partnership with Irvine Ranch Conservancy.
Now, before we move completely away from the procedure, so here we were, this newly formed, relatively city of Irvine, having only, been formed in very early 70s, coming into ownership and responsibility for some of the most important areas, biodiversity important areas. And we're just a city. We don't know how to handle threats of beetles and threats of erosion native plants. And can you
Yeah.
talk about how the Conservancy was set up and what its
Sure.
job is? And I'm going to mute because I have to
Absolutely. So the Irvine Ranch Conservancy is a nonprofit organization, and we were founded in 2005 with the purpose of making sure that all of the open space lands that had been protected over time on the Irvine Ranch were taken care of and enjoyed to the highest possible standards. And so our goal is to work with whoever shares that vision and whatever landowner is there and help them manage those lands. The city of Irvine was actually our very first partner. And I think you alluded to it, Melissa, but I think there was a little bit of genius at work in the city, which is somebody realized that this isn't really what cities normally do. They don't normally manage wilderness lands, and they needed a partner that could help them do that, and that a partner that had that expertise. And so we came together actually in 2005 and formed a partnership. But what I like to say is our relationship with the city is a partnership. We are the city's partner. We go above and beyond to help the cities succeed because we care about the land. And the mechanism by which we partner with the city is a management agreement. It's a contract that the city funds the management work that the Irvine Ranch Conservancy does every year. But we also bring a lot more to the table than that. For example, in the early years, the city did not have a trail system to speak of at all in the open space preserve south, the Bomber Canyon and Shady Canyon in that area. And Irvine Ranch Conservancy was actually able to bring a total of about $6 million in outside funding and capital to build that trail system, to build the trailheads, to do the signage, to do all of the information for the public. And so this really goes well beyond an annual management agreement to operate the land. It really truly is a partnership, and that's what we're about. You're on mute.
There you go. Well, I know we've had a lot of challenges, and not just budgetary like we're going through now, but we've had a lot of challenges related to the land itself. And
Sure.
I would love it if you would walk us through. I think you have prepared some of the challenges for this open space. Maybe as you talk through this, you could tell us, a little bit more as you go along about what even the open space, what's included in it.
Sure, yeah. I'll give a quick introduction and then someone can put up the graphic that I provided. So one of the big challenges that everyone has with maintaining the health and viability of these lands in perpetuity is the fact that they are so close in to such dense urban areas. This is not like managing Grand Teton National Park, right, where it's out in the middle of nowhere. They have their challenges, obviously, but there are special challenges with these lands being part of a wilderness area. There are also special challenges that make it being urban, as well as being part of that Mediterranean climate zone that I talked about. So I don't know, Meredith, if you can put up the graphic and I can talk a little bit about that. But so this is just a pie chart that shows the relative importance of these different challenges to managing the health and viability of these lands over time for Southern California urban wildlands. And you can see that if this is, let's call it a pizza instead of a pie, right? About 40% of the pizza is taken up with one thing, which is increased fire frequency. And to emphasize that point, the background of this slide is Hicks Canyon just north of Irvine. When it burned in 2007, it looked like a moonscape for a long, long time. These lands were actually adapted. They evolved, the ecosystems that evolved there, the natural communities that are there, evolved to a fire frequency of about once every 70 to 100 years. So our mountains actually aren't high enough to get a lot of lightning. So there weren't a lot of natural fire starts. There was some burning that was done by Native Americans, but they didn't do it catastrophically like what we've been seeing. They did it very carefully, and they did it during a time of year when the fires wouldn't get out of control. And in fact, so all of think about this, all of these plants and animals that live here have adapted to a fire coming through about every 70 years. The Tecate cypress is a great example. The Tecate cypress actually sets its seed, its cones actually open up due to the smoke from a fire. And the adult trees are killed by the fire, and then all of the young trees grow up. But these Tecate cypress don't actually start reproducing until they're about 30 or 40 years old. And then they set cones every year after that until they get to about 70. And then a fire comes in and wipes them out. And frankly, everything's fine because a whole bunch of baby cypress trees comes up. But think about it if you've got something that doesn't reproduce till every 30 or 40 years until it gets to that age. And you're now having a fire every 7 to 10 years. You can wipe that entire species out in a single generation because it burns and then it burns again and then it burns again. That's just an example, but because this is an ecosystem and all these species are intertwined with each other and they're all dependent upon each other, they're all adapted to that same fire frequency. And so we're getting fire far too often. Of course, the fire problem extends well beyond the health of the natural systems. It threatens our communities, our lives and property as well. And so this is a huge problem that everybody is trying as hard as they can to figure out how to resolve. One other word about fire before I move to some of the other challenges, and that is that our fires in Southern California and on the Irvine Ranch are very, very different than the traditional forest fires that you hear about. This is not a Smokey the Bear kind of forest fire. In fact, the whole policy around fire for decades and decades was fire prevention. And what that's led to is it's led in forested systems to old forests that have a lot of wood to burn. And when a fire catches, it becomes catastrophic. It turns out that we have the exact opposite problem down here. We have way too much fire. And our problem is actually stopping fire, not encouraging more of it. And so if you think about what we're talking about in terms of a forested system, like in Northern California, in the Sierras, where the trees are dying off due to maybe bark beetles and things like that, or at least they're getting stressed due to drought, and then they're susceptible to other things like beetles. So you have large areas of dead wood. We don't have anything like that in our shrublands. We have 5 years of growth of what's behind this little pizza that I'm showing, which is there's not a whole lot out there. And we actually need to stop fire. We need to return fire in this system back to I'll take 30 or 40 years, but 70 would be ideal. So we could talk again, I guess you're getting ready to have a town hall on fire, and I'll set it up by saying that's my piece on fires. We have way too much fire, and we need to just we need to stop ignitions, most of which occur along roadsides. And we need to restore healthy ecosystems, which actually are a lot harder to burn than all these invasive grasses that come in.
Well, Smokey was right in that only we can prevent these fires. That's really the only similarity. So in the north, they have more of a fuel issue. And down south, we have ignition. And you're right, we're getting ready to have a town hall exactly on wildfire in our Wildland Urban Interface area, the WUI. Now, in Irvine, we have more WUI than any other entity in all of Orange County, including the county itself. So we've got a lot of WUI out there. Now, we've talked about the procedure, we talked about the history. Let's get to the fun stuff. I love that not only do we have this incredible biodiversity at our doorstep, but we have a lot of opportunities to get out and enjoy it. And one of the questions we had that I'd like you to answer is, how do we learn more about the open space? So I know maybe at the end you could talk about resources, but right now I'd love it if you could just tell us where there is for us to go and enjoy. Maybe give us a little tour. And I know we have some pictures of the area. Can you tell us about the open space?
Sure. So we're going to take a little tour of the open space in and around Irvine through some photos. And before I jump into that, I'll say one of the things that the Irvine Ranch Conservancy works with all of the different landowners that we talked about before. Everybody who's adjacent, Irvine Ranch Conservancy has partnerships with all of them. And so what we've gotten everyone to do is to come together and provide a common resource for people who want to enjoy the open space. It's actually a website, and it's very easy. It's letsgooutside.org. And it's a place where if you want to experience land that's owned by the county or the city of Irvine or state parks or the city of Newport Beach, you can find it all there. You can find the information about the land. You can sign up for programs. You can sign up to volunteer. And I do want to talk a little bit about the opportunities to participate at some point in terms of volunteerism. So there, I see it up there. Melissa just put up the website, letsgooutside.org actually.
Oh, my bad, .org.
Although I think we do have .com, so if you go there, it will redirect you to .org. So
I just put "Let's Go Outside" in my Google search, and it takes me right there.
There you go. Okay, well then I'm sure it works for both of them.
You've teed up Bomber Canyon, and
Yeah.
I grew up in Orange County, and I used to be a park ranger reserve, and I worked in Aliso and Wood Canyon. I didn't work in Bomber Canyon. So I had always heard about the beauty of Bomber Canyon, and having grown up here with the Blue Angels and the base and knowing the lore of the bomber that went down, I always thought Bomber Canyon was like a military bomber. And it wasn't until, really I became a commissioner in the city that I learned that it's actually a name. It's not a description of a bomber. So can you tell us about it?
Sure. So when the Irvine Ranch was a cattle ranch, there were actually two major places on the ranch, one in the south and one in the north, one on the coast and one inland, where all of the cattle would be brought in and corralled in order to get them ready to put on trucks and take to market. And the one in the north is called Augustine Ranch. It's off Santiago Canyon Road. And that's now owned by the County of Orange, and we've actually turned it into a major trailhead with them. And then Bomber Canyon, which is what you're looking at here now. Most of the area that is sort of bright green and even the lighter green in the middle of the picture was all part of an area that was very heavily grazed for many, many decades, because that's where the cattle hung out until they were loaded on to the trucks. About down below the center of the photo is the old corral area that has a lot of the old cattle implements. It has a cattle chute, and it has the loading area, and it's been preserved, and those things are now part of a little nature walk that you can see around there. So this was the primary cattle resource area for the ranch for many, many decades. Then when the land was turned over to the city of Irvine in the early 2000s, it became part of the Irvine Open Space Preserve South, the southern part. And the city set about working with Irvine Ranch Conservancy to create a trail system. When we started working together in 2005 in this area, there was 1 half-mile out and back trail, and that was it. There was nothing else there. And working together, we have built a trail system that is now 25 miles. Some of it takes advantage of some old ranch roads, but some of the ones you see in this photo were created specifically for visitor experiences. The one on the right is part of the Bomber Meadows Trail, which starts at the trailhead for Bomber Canyon off Shady Canyon Drive. And then the one on the left, this kind of the little one that snakes around, is the Bomber Bypass Trail that actually allows people to go around the cattle camp where the city does activities and summer camps and things like that. So those two trails are open all day, every day for self-guided access. And then there are other trails that go into sensitive habitat in the area. If you want to go to the next picture.
And then I would say the one on the left goes right up to the 73, and the vistas are beautiful.
Yes. So just to the left of the photo that we were just looking at, if you're still up in the air in a helicopter where this picture was taken from, is Shady Canyon. And Shady Canyon is really, really sensitive habitat. It's in the interior. And one of my favorite pictures is or things about this picture is, this picture was taken from about 800 feet of altitude. And the only human development you can see in the area is in the upper left-hand part of the photo. We're in the middle of Irvine, and there's all this wilderness open space in Shady Canyon. And there's a network of really special trails. Hikers and mountain bikers call them single track trails because they're only about 3 feet wide. And they're really special trails, and they go down into Shady Canyon. Those trails are not open every single day, but they're open for guided access programs, docent-led access. They're open for wilderness access days, or at least they were until we had the current pandemic. And then we'll get back to that someday soon. But we have monthly wilderness access days where people can hike and bike and ride horses on these trails as well. So Shady Canyon is a really beautiful and very sensitive part of Irvine. It's sort of the core of the biodiversity of the land.
Mike, can you tell us, I always was very surprised to find about, number one, that we knew so much about the impact of human presence on wildlife in our own backyard, number one. And number two, the difference between different usages. So if you could explain why, for example, some places are only open for mountain biking, some places only open for certain types of activity, and how wildlife react to the different human uses, this would be a great time.
Sure. It turns out that different recreational uses have different impacts on natural resources. And there are, so a group of birders that is walking through looking for birds and is very quiet and moves very slowly has a very different impact on wildlife than a group of hikers who are hiking and having a great time and talking amongst themselves and talking loudly. And they have a different impact than a group of mountain bikers who kind of zips through very quickly. So to get an idea of how to manage all of those things, Irvine Ranch Conservancy has actually been doing studies for about 10 years now, published in the peer-reviewed scientific literature about monitoring and evaluating the impacts of those different kinds of uses on wildlife and on the land. And that then allows us to work with the city to make decisions about how the land is managed that best balances nature and recreation, which is, in fact, that's the ultimate goal, is if you can find that balance and manage it dynamically over time, then that's the key to success. So one of the ways we do that is we look at wildlife movement patterns in relation to human activity. We've even found that different size groups of people have different impacts, and those impacts last a different amount of time, believe it or not. So when we do a wilderness access day, which is all the trails are open from 8 a.m. to 2 p.m. on a Saturday, the wildlife all kind of goes into hiding, and they pretty much don't come out for about 2 days after that. But if you take a group of 20 people and you take them on a docent-led interpretive hike and you hike through, the wildlife will come back within hours and start their normal activity. So again, neither one of those is necessarily good or bad, and they're all really important for people to experience the land, but how we manage the impact of that is different based on what those recreation activities are. So that's Shady Canyon. Let's take another.
So for example, if you had a trail that was open all the time, wildlife would leave the area permanently. Right. And so I know there's a frustration that people want to always have access to the trail, but if we had them open all the time, you wouldn't have the same natural beauty, you wouldn't have the same diversity, and you wouldn't have an impact on, it wouldn't be the same.
It wouldn't be the same. That's right. So two thoughts on that. One is Irvine has done a really, really great job of balancing those opportunities as well. So of that 25-mile trail system that I mentioned, half of the trails are open all day, every day. And they're the trails that are not in the sensitive areas. They're the trails that connect to other lands like Laguna Coast Wilderness Park and Crystal Cove State Park that are open every day. So it really maximizes the visitor opportunities there. And then the other half of the trails are open from what we call managed access, which is docent-led or wilderness access days. And it turns out that if your chances of having an encounter with wildlife that you want to see, like a deer or something like that, are much greater increased in the areas that have managed access. There was a recent study that just came out from the University of Washington that looked at why people like urban wilderness. What is their affinity for it? What do they look for when they go there? And it turns out that by far, way more than anything else, was encounters with wildlife. They want to see wildlife. And in order to maintain that value, you have to manage the land in a way that keeps the wildlife around. And so that's kind of the core of the challenge, is balancing the demand for use with the desire for people to encounter and see and enjoy wildlife.
Great. Are we ready to move on to the next space?
So this is the East Fork Trail, which is comes out of Bomber Canyon and actually goes into Shady Canyon. I put that in there because this was actually the trail that existed in 2005. It has a really steep slope on it. It has something like a 22% slope. And so people love to hike it for a cardio workout. But you can see it's just a beautiful way of getting away. Again, we're 5 minutes or less from downtown Irvine. And this is the kind of experience that people can have.
And Mike, I noticed you managed to get a photo that doesn't have all that invasive mustard in it.
Yeah, that was deliberate. One of the artifacts of 100+ years of cattle grazing is a lot of invasive weeds that were decent forage for the cattle, particularly exotic grasses that can take over a place and actually make the fire problem worse. So we have a lot of reasons to not like exotic grasses. But the mustard that came in is native to the Mediterranean, actually, in Northern Africa. And it can take over a place. And people love it for about 2 weeks in the spring when it has bright yellow flowers, and then it turns brown, and it's also a fire hazard. So we're not big fans of mustard.
Well, this is a picture that has a lot of diversity in it, and it looks like it's really been remediated back to natives.
Yes, there's a lot of restoration that's going on in those areas.
Beautiful.
And that's another part of our partnership with the city, is to do habitat restoration in these areas, particularly the areas that were heavily impacted by historic land use. So let's go into the next one. Shady Canyon, just one of the features. So one of the things that Irvine Ranch Conservancy has done with the city is created really great trail systems and features within those trails. This is the Shady Canyon Bridge, and it was built to actually withstand a couple of horses on it at the same time, so a couple thousand pounds. But it is it's a really beautiful thing, and you can see it's the only piece of human construction around it. One little interesting thing about this bridge, you can't really tell from the photo, but it's about 40 feet long, and we actually had the spans for the bridge helicoptered in over that ridge in the background. And helicopter came in. We had set up the little grooves for the bridge supports to go in, and the helicopter pilot lowered them right into the support trenches without even missing a beat. So it was really kind of a fun experience, and now people can enjoy that. But you can see it's part of our single track trail system that the city has. So let's go to the next one. Another place that's very close, that's also in the Open Space Preserve South, is the Quail Hill Loop Trail, and that's very popular. That's a almost 3 mile loop that starts right off of Shady Canyon Drive, right by the freeway. There's a beautiful trailhead there with permanent restrooms and parking, and people use it all the time. This is a self-guided trail. It actually, interestingly enough, is the only trail in the Open Space Preserve that allows dogs on leash. That it turns out that most wildlife consider dogs to be another form of wildlife and a threat to them. And so dogs in the open space are not part of how you keep wildlife around. But on the Quail Hill Loop Trail, people can walk their dogs on leash, and and it's a great experience for folks. This trail gets used all the time. So we can go to the next one. This is Serrano Ridge Trail, very popular with mountain bikers. This is a trail that connects between the Irvine Open Space Preserve and Laguna Coast Wilderness Park as part of the regional trail system that goes well beyond the 22 miles of the city to about, gosh, there's probably over 100 miles of trails in the total coastal wilderness area that this connects to. You can go to the next one.
You could take, you could connect to the ocean from this, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can actually park at the Bomber Canyon trailhead and hike to the ocean without ever crossing a road. And it's a pretty spectacular hike.
Well, you go under the 73.
You go under the toll road. And in fact, what people often do is they'll take two cars and they'll stage one down at the coast, and then they'll drive everybody up and they'll park at Bomber and then hike down and then drive back up. But the really hardy souls hike down and hike back up.
Yeah. Not in the summer.
Yeah, and the views from the ridge are just spectacular, as you might imagine. So the next one. Orchard Hills is actually in the northern Irvine Open Space Preserve, and this area is managed access. So there are lots and lots of programs. By the way, I neglected to mention that, you know, we're under a challenging time right now in terms of public activities in these managed access areas. But during normal times, there are literally hundreds of programs that go on every year. So it isn't like these places are unavailable. They're just available with a docent for those interpretive hikes. But Orchard Hills Trail, you can see that you get a view. Actually, we're looking towards Bomber and Shady Canyons. Those hills in the background are part of the coast hills, and you can see all of Irvine. It's a really spectacular thing. And when you stand up on that ridge in the summertime, you can actually feel ocean breeze.
Now, Mike, you and I have done some hikes too. So when we are able to start again, this is kind of a replacement for the hikes that we do together.
Yes.
So let's get one on the calendar as soon as another Whiting Ranch sinks, or maybe we'll do Orchard Hills Trail this time.
Orchard Hills could be a lot of fun. Yeah.
And I'd like to do a night hike too, because there's so much.
Night hikes are very popular. One of the things about doing programs with trained naturalists is that they can actually do the kind of programs that people might not either be comfortable with or able to do on their own. So one of the things we do is a night hike. We do full moon hikes, probably not for a little while. They will come back like everything else will. And we do full moon hikes where no flashlights are allowed, and you hike by the light of the full moon, and it is truly spectacular. It's one of the most popular programs we do. We even have a naturalist who has a bat sonar detector that allows you to, they put it on the ground and turn it on, and they can actually see what kinds of bats are flying by the sounds they make. The bat detector is also a fun one. So there's all kinds of neat opportunities that are beyond just getting out and getting on a trail. So let's go to the next one. So another feature that is in Irvine, but is of use to all of the whole landscape that Irvine Ranch Conservancy works on, is our native seed farm. And this is in Irvine, North Irvine, just north of Portola, off of Jeffrey. And it's an old strawberry field that we actually turned into a farm to create native seed. And you might ask, well, why would we want to create native seed? And it's because we have so much habitat restoration going on that we need tons of native seed, and it has to be fresh and high quality, and we need to know where it comes from, because we don't want to plant a lupin that came from Santa Barbara in Irvine. We want to plant a lupin that came from Irvine in Irvine. And so we're able to harvest seed from the wild and then come back and grow it in as crops. And we harvest in a good year, we'll get close to 2,000 pounds of seed. We normally average about a half a ton a year of 52 different species, including some endangered species. You can see in this photo, the pink is what's called owl's clover, and the purple is Canterbury bells, which is a beautiful plant that if you touch it will give you a nasty rash. And the yellow is called goldfields. This program, this farm is actually powered by volunteerism. And I'll mention, actually you can go to the next slide as well because it's also a farm slide. So I'll talk about the farm. That's our poppies. Everybody was bragging about their super blooms last year. And we like to say we have a super bloom of poppies every year on the farm. And so this farm is powered by volunteerism. Irvine Ranch Conservancy has over 500 regular volunteers. Those are people who are trained and they work with the Conservancy and they give their time regularly. There are over 500 of them. Last year, those 500 people contributed over almost 50,000 hours of their efforts, which is really substantial. But the volunteers love to work at the farm cultivating, and there's something to do all year round. You can sow seed in the spring, and you can weed weeds in the late spring, and then you can harvest seed in the summer, and you can process seed in the winter, and it's really a great place to be. It's become a wonderful resource. I also like to say, if you want to learn native plants, this is the place to do it because we have 52 different species. So you want to go to the next one. So not in Irvine, but near Irvine are some real backcountry places. They're very much like a national park quality experience that you can get without having to, get on an airplane or rent a hotel room or whatever. You can sleep in your own bed and have a national park experience in your backyard. And one of those areas is Loma Ridge. And this is, a beauty shot in the springtime. A lot of what you see in the foreground is actually the non-native grass that the cattle used to eat. And in a couple of weeks, that would be brown. But in the background is really, really healthy native habitats that stretch all the way from North Irvine all the way to the 91 freeway. So Loma Ridge is a great place to visit as well. And we're doing a lot of habitat restoration there.
Next.
You can go to the next one.
Oh.
There truly is a backcountry. It's called Fremont Canyon, and there's 20,000 acres in the backcountry that has really remote trails and places that look like a little tiny bit like Yosemite with granite outcrops and views all the way to the coast, and you can see the Hollywood Hills, and you can see, if you turn around, see the San Bernardino Mountains, and it's really a spectacular place. This is really remote. It's a very popular place for mountain bike tours. It would take many hours to hike there, but we do have hikes that go into parts of Fremont Canyon in the backcountry with volunteers that people really, really like.
Yeah, I'm realizing I've got a map behind me of all the open space. There
you go.
In the Irvine Ranch Conservancy. It's a really enormous area.
It is enormous. It's, that's a good point. This land is actually larger than some of our most popular national parks. It's larger than Acadia National Park in Maine. It's larger than Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. It's larger than Bryce Canyon in Utah. It's a large area. It is the equivalent of having a national park in our backyard. What's different though is national parks are all owned by one entity, the National Park Service, and they take care of it with one organization. Our challenge is that these lands, while they may be naturally connected, they are they're owned by multiple local governments, state, city. I mean, even on the coastal area that we were just visiting before by pictures, in the 20,000 acres that's there, a third of it's owned by the state, a third of it's owned by the County of Orange, and a third of it's owned by the City of Irvine. And so managing it together cohesively is the only way that it can approximate a national park experience. So you can go to the next one if you'd like. So this is the iconic image. You can see we love it so much that it's even my Zoom background. And this is the Sinks in Limestone Canyon. You can reach this from two different areas, Augustine Ranch staging area, which is off of Santiago Canyon Road, and then the Agua Shannon Portola staging area, which is right at the end of Portola Parkway and the toll road. There are frequent hikes that go there. It's a good workout. It's about 4 miles in and 4 miles out, but it's worth it. And we've built viewing platforms on either side. There's one on the east and one on the west. And you can get really gorgeous views of the Sinks. This is another place that has managed access, but it's also open under normal circumstances. for monthly wilderness access days. And those provide opportunities for people to go self-guided to the sinks. So you want me to talk about our monitoring program?
Yes, please, because
Okay,
we get
so
a lot of our selfies, our wildlife selfies.
Wildlife selfies, right? So as I mentioned, one of the programs that Irvine Range Conservancy has is monitoring wildlife, both to just look at movement patterns, see how they're doing, make sure that the species that we're looking for are still there and their populations are doing well. And we actually started using these remote wildlife cameras in 2007. The technology was really kind of just getting started. Back when I was in graduate school and was using remote cameras, they actually used film, and you could only get 36 pictures at a time, and 35 of them were blank, and it was not a very useful technology. What changed it was two things. One was the memory chip technology, and the other is battery technology. And in 2007, we started using old-time batteries and very small memory cards, but it was still better than film. And we started collecting wildlife pictures from about 60 different cameras placed around the landscape. And over the last 10 or 15 years, the technology has gotten so remarkable and the cost has come down. We used to pay close to $800 for a remote camera, and now some of them are under $100 to get the same, actually better technology. What we've been able to do over that time is amass a database of over 1 million photos of wildlife. Yeah, this is another program that's powered by volunteers. We have one staff person whose job is to oversee the program, do the data analysis and things like that. But these cameras are serviced by volunteers, and they come out and remove the memory chip, replace it with a fresh one, remove the batteries, replace them with fresh ones, and come back and then download the pictures and start to sort them, and we find what's on there. When you get a database that's that big, not only do you get all kinds of really cool photos, which you're gonna see some in a minute, but you also get data about each camera location. How often are we seeing deer? What time of year are we seeing deer? How does it relate to weather conditions? How does it relate to public access patterns? Are we seeing deer at the same time as we're seeing mountain lions? Are we seeing a healthy population of bobcats? Those things can then be analyzed, and we can get a really good handle on what's going on in this system through a long-term monitoring program like this. And most important, what we can do is then use that information to adjust our management patterns in order to, again, create that balance between long-term protection and public enjoyment. So I always like to end with some shots from the wildlife cameras, because I mean, you can almost randomly pick a dozen of them out of our database and they're all going to be great, but I picked a few that I thought people would enjoy. So most of these were in Irvine, by the way. So there's a young fawn, very curious about the camera. You can go through the next one. Bobcats. So it turns out that bobcats, each one has a different pelt pattern. It's like a fingerprint. And you can tell which bobcat it is by knowing its pelt pattern. We have so many photos of bobcats that one of our volunteer projects is for the volunteers to set up and identify the bobcats by their pelt patterns, and then they are literally monitoring individual bobcats, where they're going, what they're doing. You can see that the flash doesn't seem to bother their behavior at all. This one's got a nice little rat. So many spectacular photos of wildlife. In the North Ranch, we have a very healthy deer herd. Contrary to what you might think, the deer aren't spread all around the landscape. The herd kind of migrates depending on the time of year. It depends on resources, right? So when it's the rainy season and there's water everywhere, the deer kind of do disperse and they kind of go all over, and there's food everywhere, and they're fattening up, getting ready for mating season. But then when it starts to get brown and things are not so tasty and the water resources dry up, the deer will concentrate in areas where there is water. We actually keep a number of the old cattle troughs from the ranching days filled with water as a resource for wildlife. We decided to do that even though those are not natural sources of water, partly because California is in such an extended drought that we didn't want water to be a limiting factor on the wildlife populations if we could help it. They're under enough stress already. So you get gorgeous photos like this. Yeah, there's the, I mean, wildlife doing their thing, right? They're not concerned. Although we do have a few photos of the flash and the deer about 4 feet in the air because apparently it scared him a little bit. Gray fox. People think of foxes as just, you know, that's just another thing that's out there. Gray foxes are actually an indicator of how healthy the ecosystem is. They are, you don't find them if the ecosystem is not doing well. And so we have a very active monitoring program for gray fox, because it's again an indicator of that, you know, the system is healthy and doing well. Springtime is time for babies, and we get lots and lots and lots of baby shots. Some of the fun ones are big piles of baby coyotes wrestling with each other and things like that. But those are always popular with people. Baby skunks. Yep. So one thing I always say is wildlife selfies are a thing. And I can't tell you how many wildlife selfies we've gotten. There's this post with this box on it in the middle of their habitat. And so they come and check it out, and it's not threatening to them. And so we get a lot of selfies. The deer in particular are inquisitive, but just about every species that we take pictures of does a selfie at one time or another. So this is a deer. Sometimes they get really close. Hummingbird, checking it out. That's another, yeah, flying by. The camera sometimes doesn't have a fast enough shutter speed in order to freeze the action of birds that are flying. And so we get all these interesting distorted photos of birds when they fly by. And this one's a bobcat at night checking out the camera. We've also been able to see a lot of animal behavior that you wouldn't normally get to observe any other way. So that's pretty important. I think those are all the photos that I have, I believe.
Now, Mike, I've got some, if you wouldn't mind running through them. We
Sure.
had, when did we go out together? Was that February?
It was right before this thing all happened. Yeah, so it was February.
It was a beautiful day, and we had scheduled to take a VIP out, and she had canceled. So you and I decided we were going to go do it anyway. And so I took a few photos. We had a lot of rain, but maybe a week or so before. And the ground was very, very soft. And what was interesting was that these prints were all in the same area and all very fresh. So as you look on the left, right, can you tell us what those pictures are that we see those prints?
Sure, a little animal tracking knowledge here.
Wow.
There are three different, actually a minimum of 3 different species in the photo on the left. There are bobcats, there's coyotes, and there's a mountain lion. I bet you can tell right away which one is the mountain lion. And that's
cats can retract their claws, right? So that's how you can tell. Well,
Right.
first of all, it's big.
It's big. There's nothing that makes a print that big in the open space than a mountain lion. But you're absolutely right. Cats, just like domestic cats, when they're walking, they retract their claws. So if you see a print in the mud and it doesn't have claw marks, then it is most likely a cat. And out in the wildlands, it's most likely a bobcat. So you can see down sort of in the lower left quadrant of that's a coyote, but the one right to the left of that, that's not really a full print. That's actually a bobcat print in there. And then the one right above it is one of the clearest coyote prints that I've ever seen. And you can sure see the claws because coyotes are a dog and dogs can't retract their claws. And so they leave a very distinctive print as well. Sometimes it's hard to tell whether there's a domestic dog running around that left the prints or a coyote, but out in places like we went, it's almost always a coyote.
Yeah, and you know, every time I've gone out into the open space, either on a hike or on a drive with you, what's amazing is it's always very, very different. And this was an incredible day where we got all these prints. And then can you tell us what's on the right?
Yes, so on the right is actually a deer print where it actually stepped in some pretty deep mud and kind of got stuck. It's not a great representation of a deer print, but you can actually tell the deer, the toes of the deer kind of point together. And so you can tell what direction the deer is walking because the front of the print, the tips of the toes are closer together than the back. So when you see deer prints on the ground, you can tell exactly which way. And many times in places like this out on the land, we will see deer prints and then mountain lion prints right behind them.
Yeah, and that's what we were looking at here. Did we have another slide? I think we had some raccoon and some bunnies too. Oh yeah, and I love this photo because you put your hand down there for scale of that. These are just different prints. I guess I didn't send the other ones, but this was incredible the way that we had all of these prints in this one area. It was like a crossroads for all of them. And so look, there's your hand next to those lion prints, giving it for scale. So
and just to throw a little bit of geology in here, just because this is a special place for geology as well, this is exactly how fossils are made. There's a mud pit and things walk through it and they make prints, and then that gets covered up with more mud and those prints become fossil prints someday. So we don't have dinosaurs around, but at least not now, but we have a lot of dinosaur fossils. And this is how fossilized prints get made.
There's so much to see out in our own backyard, from incredible geology, wildlife, and just there's something different about the smells of the different sages and the brush out there. And I'm looking forward to getting out there again. And maybe we can do another tour pretty soon. But I want to thank you so much for coming on today and giving us a tour in our own backyard. And thank you so much. Pretty incredible. Before we go, I'm sorry. One last thing. Can you tell us, in addition to the Let's Go Outside, are you aware of any other books on the history or the biodiversity of this area?
Wow. There are some that have been written. There are a few field guides. The best thing to do would simply be to do an internet search. There are books on the history of the ranch. There are books on the geology of the area, and there are books on the natural history as well. So best way to do it would be just to do an internet search, I would say.
Well, Mike, I really appreciate you taking the time. And next time we're going to get out from behind a desk, and maybe we'll go film it. I mean, we've been able to do great stuff on the native seed farm and do our walks out in the beautiful open space. And this was the best that we could do today. So I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We love our partnership with the city, and we look forward to a lot more great years together. Thanks.
All right. Good evening.